Okay. I have one question for Piotr and then for all the three presenters on the panel. But before I make a question, Christian, I think this is a fantastic paper and I would really want to congratulate you on the stuff that you've shown. I haven't seen that before, but it's great. Piotr, you've shown us there is... You can't hear me? Do you want me to repeat? Congratulations to Christian on fantastic paper. I can do it again and again and again. Piotr, the question, you've shown us the results for different birth years. I think it's a very interesting way to look at the results, and it's very, innovative also in the literature. But one of the things I was keeping in the back of my head is, like, when people enter labor market just after college, it is kind of standard. They do more routine jobs, and then they can build up experience, and with the time, they start getting, like, more responsible jobs that are not that routine despite being cognitive. So maybe the thing that you find that those 84-something people born, like my younger sister, but do mostly routine stuff, is just that they haven't progressed in their career yet, whereas those that were born 1970s and like earlier are already at higher stages of career. I'm not saying that the story about young cohorts entering in early 1990s didn't get the break. I mean, they surely had a huge advantage over younger cohorts. But there can be something about career progress in your story. And the question I had for all these three panel speakers is, every time I think about those, using this on-it data and stuff, I have this great doubt that we're all kind of automatically assuming that the task content of jobs relative to the United States applies everywhere else. I think it is a challenging assumption, and I would like to hear your comments on how do you feel using this data, and how do you think that can possibly give a little, let's just say, warning sign on any conclusions that we make. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps we'll take a few more questions over there.
Wojciech Sabat, Warsaw School of Economics. I have a question for Christian, because you made a distinction between normal and abstract job, and I would like to understand it better, because I understood that normal jobs are those which are non-routine and easy, which is very strange to me, and those abstract jobs are non-routine and complex. And if you would be so kind and give some examples of jobs belonging to both groups, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. Any more comments or questions?
Hi, Jan Witejski from IBS. I have also a question to Christian. So I'm pretty convinced about the story of changing parameters between 1950 and 1970. But I think afterwards, I might be wrong, but my intuition is that the parameter, the productivity parameter for the services, for the high services, was growing very fast because of the ICT. This was, primarily improving the work of lawyers and stuff. So if you keep the model as it is, it would imply the reverse of the story then, right? If there is still complementarity between the sectors, you should see the fall in employment of high service, of the number of people in the high services. So either there is a switch from complementarity of sectors to the substitutability of the sectors, or there's something else. I don't know, can you comment on your model from 1970 until now? Thanks.
Okay, anyone else?
So my question to Andrea and Christian is why do you still show us graphs of wage changes by occupation when we know that there is huge issues with composition, basically? And in fact, Christian, you said it in your model, you can't sign the effect on wage changes because of these compositional issues. So instead, so my question is, what would your model actually show? Like, how important are these? Given that your calibration seems to work pretty well, it would be interesting to see how the compositional sort of aspects drive the observed wage changes. And in terms of the descriptives, I think it would be interesting to see just the wage changes at each, say, quantile of the distribution, not looking at occupations. I think that would be more informative than looking at the occupations. Sorry, that was more a comment than a question.
Okay, so I'll take advantage of my position to have the last question to Andrea. Yeah, I'll have the last question to Andrea, actually. So what is the data you are using, and how good do you think you are at measuring the wages at the top? And can it explain perhaps partly the results that you get, that is the low growth of labor incomes at the top?
Okay. Well, aside from this, the wage data come from data, which is data that the OMS uses for official wage statistics. So they are kind of regarded as the gold standard for wage statistics in the UK. Of course, I understand the problem that you're basically referring to with measuring wages at the top, but there's no reason to think that this will be more severe in the 2000s than in previous years. My point really is about how the performance deteriorates over time. Well, the question is, yeah. Is it working? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. In terms of looking at changes in occupational wages, I agree. Of course, there is a lot going on. And there are selection issues, and the selection can change over time, and it can change in response to the technology, etc., etc. But the bottom line, and perhaps this didn't come across as clearly in this presentation, but what I'm engaging with in the paper is this idea that the future of the labor market is entirely in the hands of robots. And this story is said even in the academic literature in a very simple way, where you just need to have done 1 year of economics to understand it. So if there is a decline in demand for middling occupations, so you would expect wages and employment to go down. And I just say that, well, that's not the case for the UK at least. And this might well be because there is a much more complex story which has to do with selection, etc., etc. But the bottom line is really the simple story that technology is driving everything in a simple way. It's just not. It doesn't work. So I would agree with you. That's left for future research. Maybe we can talk about that. And on the classification of occupation, if I may say briefly, I very much agree with the concern about measuring the routine, the task content of different occupations in different countries using the US measures. And that's the point I was referring to in the one slide where I said there are different ways you can do that. And I try to do that using different measures. In my paper specifically, I use both the US-derived measure, which is using the Gusman paper, which is published, but I also use survey data for the UK from the British Skills Survey, where workers are actually asked 36 questions about what they actually do on the job. And then I use these measures to build different routine measures. And I can say also something I didn't cover here. We're actually writing a paper with co-authors exactly on this, using data from the European Working Conditions Survey, where you have some information on tasks which are collected in a harmonized way across Europe. And the point that we're making in the paper is exactly this, that if you take the same occupation in different countries at the same time, there is a lot of variation in terms of the tasks that people report doing across different countries. So there is a lot of heterogeneity that seems to be completely swept under the rug in this literature, and might be relevant from a substantive point of view as well. So, if I can just elaborate on that, and then ask.
Thank you, Joanna, for this question. I'm really happy you asked that, because it's a very, very valid point. And on top of that, what Andrea has already said, there has been a couple of attempts when people try to compare the ONET-based measures with some other surveys. There is a paper by Michal Hendel when he compares a couple of data sources, I think one from Canada, one from the UK, some others with the ONET-based. They are quite similar. There have been 2 surveys in Italy and Czech Republic conducted in the last 5-7 years, modeled after ONET, and the correlation of task measures derived from these surveys was like 85-90%. So it's pretty good. And one thing that we would like to do next year is to take advantage of the work that is being done at the World Bank right now, where the people in the jobs team, they use the STEP survey. STEP, for those of you which don't know, is a modeled on PIAC, but it is conducted by the World Bank in the developing countries. And they use the STEP data to estimate the task content of occupations in emerging countries. And the first results that we have already seen say that the non-routine contents are very similar. There is a difference in routine cognitive, which is higher usually in the developing countries. But when it comes to non-routine, it's very similar. So I think that the ONET, it's far from perfect, but it's probably the only source that we can use on a broad basis, and it's not that bad, I would say. And answering briefly the question on cohorts, yes, that's the case, that the people who are entrants, they tend to have routine cognitive jobs and then to move to rather non-routine cognitive jobs. Because of nature of the data, we aren't really able to study that in detail in that paper on the entire region. We've done it for Poland, where we can track cohorts year after year, so we can see a clearly like an inverse U-shape of routine cognitive contents of job of every cohort. At the same time, it's just a comparison in 2 times. It seems that the 84, 88 cohort has a little bit more of them that our cohort had at their age.
Right. Let me start also by talking about the classification of tasks. And I showed you some pictures with abstract versus manual versus routine. That's not our classification, but it's a classification used by David Author with various courses. But essentially, there's a matrix. A job is either routine or not routine, and it's routine if it can easily be automated. And there's a second element, which is based on how complex is the job. Is it something that is different every time, or is it rather repetitive? And the stuff that's complex, that's what's the stuff that's complex but not routine, that's abstract, and the non-routine bit that is rather that is relatively little complex, that's called manual in that literature. Then let me move on to the second question. I'm not quite sure I understood your question 100%, but I think the answer that I have to give you is what we feed in the model is observed labor productivity growth. We do not look at the source of that labor productivity growth. So this could be capital accumulation, this can be TFP growth, this can be increased use of computer technology. So whatever we feed in the model takes into account already the effect of ICT that we have observed since the 1980s. And lastly, with the composition effect on wages, I didn't have much time to go into the details of the model, but basically what we can establish in the model for sure is that per efficiency units of labor there is an increase in the wage in high-skilled services, but the composition effect is that the average ability or the average productivity of a worker in that expanding sector falls. I don't think we did a quantification exercise how big this is for the wages, but what we have done is we did an exercise where we computed by how much does the computation of the labor productivity growth in each sector, by how much is this biased due to the selection issue? And the answer is it's tiny. It's 0.02. percentage points. And my hunch is for wages it's the same, because we do see that in the average wages, that in the model they move, in the simulated model, they move in the same direction as these wages per efficiency unit. So quantitatively in our calibration that composition effect is small.